Hey there! Tonight we begin with a journey into the surprisingly decent lives of medieval peasants, where modern stereotypes about constant misery, starvation, and brutal oppression dissolve before historical evidence revealing that ordinary rural people often worked fewer hours than modern employees, ate more varied and nutritious diets than many contemporary workers, enjoyed extensive leisure time with numerous religious festivals and holidays, lived in tight-knit communities providing social support that atomized modern society lacks, possessed genuine skills and autonomy over their work that assembly line labour eliminated, and experienced elements of life quality that industrialisation destroyed rather than created. From the shocking statistics showing medieval peasants worked perhaps 150 days per year compared to modern full-time employment's 250 days, to the evidence that pre-industrial diets were often healthier than processed food that dominates modern consumption, from the extensive common lands providing resources that enclosure movements stole to the strong community bonds that economic mobility and urbanisation shattered, from the genuine work satisfaction that came from skilled craft labour to the local autonomy that centralised states gradually eliminated. The story of medieval peasant life reveals that progress often meant regression in specific dimensions of human well-being, even while advancing in others, creating a complex picture where some aspects of medieval peasant existence were genuinely superior to conditions that came later, and even to aspects of modern life. So before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if genuinely enjoying what's shared here. And let those comments know where the listening is happening from and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see who's joining from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When thinking about medieval peasants, the modern imagination immediately conjures images shaped by selective historical memory and by progressive narratives about history. Wretched serfs toiling endlessly in fields, starving through harsh winters, oppressed by cruel lords, living in hovels, dying young from disease and violence, representing nadir of human existence from which modernity rescued humanity. These images draw from Victorian propaganda about pre-industrial misery, from Enlightenment narratives about progress, and from selective attention to genuine hardships, while ignoring the complete picture of medieval rural life. The reality that emerges from careful historical examination is far more complex and considerably more positive than stereotypes suggest. Medieval peasants certainly faced genuine hardships, including periodic famines, epidemic diseases, and political oppression, yet they also experienced aspects of life that many modern workers might envy. Extensive leisure time, strong community bonds, meaningful work, genuine autonomy over daily life, and integration into natural and social environments that industrial capitalism destroyed. The comparison isn't simple, medieval life was better, but rather recognition that progress has been uneven, that gains in some areas accompanied losses in others, and that medieval peasants had certain advantages that modern nostalgia for pre-industrial life isn't entirely unjustified in recognising. Picture this: England, perhaps a village in Kent around 1450, after the Black Death had improved peasant conditions, but before Tudor enclosures began destroying them, a peasant family wakes in their cottage with the sun. The father and his teenage son will work in their fields today, but it's July, so the heavy ploughing and planting is finished, and the harvest hasn't yet begun. They'll work perhaps 6 hours today, taking a break during the hottest midday period. The work is in their own fields on land they've held for generations, growing food primarily for their own consumption. Tomorrow is a saint's feast day, so they won't work at all. The village will gather for services, then for games, drinking and socialising that will continue into the evening. Next week they'll owe 2 days of labour service to the Lord's domain, but the steward isn't particularly demanding, and the work will be done alongside neighbours with whom they'll talk and joke. The mother and daughter spend the day on household tasks, brewing ale, tending the garden, caring for chickens and a pig, spinning wool. The evening brings a simple but adequate meal of pottage with vegetables from the garden, bread, cheese and ale. After eating, the family might gather with neighbours, or the father might work on repairing a tool, or they might simply rest. They'll sleep when it gets dark and wake with the sun, as they've always done. This scene isn't utopian fantasy, but represents ordinary life that historical evidence supports. tonight's journey explores multiple dimensions of medieval peasant life that were genuinely better than stereotypes suggest. The surprisingly reasonable work hours and extensive leisure time, the adequate and often nutritious diet that sustained healthy populations, the strong community bonds that provided social support and meaning, the access to common resources that provided economic security, the genuine skills and autonomy that made work satisfying, the local governance that provided real political participation, the festivals and entertainments that enriched cultural life, the housing that was more adequate than assumed, the environmental integration that provided health benefits, the comparative analysis showing some aspects got worse, not better after medieval period, the regional and temporal variations that complicate simple generalizations, and the overall assessment that reveals medieval peasant life as neither utopian nor hellish, but as complex existence with genuine advantages alongside acknowledged hardships. The actual working hours that medieval peasants spent in productive labour were dramatically fewer than modern full-time employment requires, with extensive holidays, seasonal variations and customary limits on labour demands creating far more leisure time than stereotypes about constant toil suggest. Understanding the reality of peasant work hours fundamentally challenges narratives about industrial capitalism, liberating workers from medieval oppression. The agricultural calendar that structured peasant work created intense periods of labour during ploughing, planting and harvest seasons, interspersed with much lighter work during other periods. The spring ploughing and planting demanded long days of hard work for several weeks. The autumn harvest similarly required intensive labour to bring in crops before weather destroyed them. Yet between these peaks, agricultural work was much lighter, maintaining fields, tending animals, repairing tools and buildings, but not requiring the dawn-to-dusk labour that harvest demanded. The seasonal variation meant that average daily work hours across the year were much lower than peak season would suggest. The calculation of annual work days attempted by historians examining medieval sources suggests that peasants worked between 150 and 200 days per year, depending on region, period, and specific circumstances. The remaining days were church holidays, Sundays, and periods when weather or seasonal patterns made agricultural work impossible or unnecessary. The comparison with modern full-time employment, requiring roughly 250 workdays annually, shows that medieval peasants had 50 to 100 more days of leisure per year than contemporary workers. The difference is substantial, equivalent to 10 to 20 weeks of additional vacation beyond what modern workers receive. The religious holidays that medieval Christianity provided were numerous and were genuinely observed as non-work days. The church calendar included not just Sundays, but also major feasts, saints' days, and various other celebrations that required cessation of work. The estimate is that religious holidays plus Sundays totaled perhaps 150 to 180 days per year, when work was prohibited or at least strongly discouraged. The religious requirement to rest on these days meant that even demanding lords couldn't require labour on church holidays without facing ecclesiastical criticism and peasant resistance, justified by religious duty. The customary limitations on labour services owed to lords meant that even unfree serfs had defined obligations, beyond which lords couldn't demand additional work without compensation. The manorial records documenting labour services show specific numbers of days per year or per season that peasants owed, with customs limiting lords' demands to what tradition established. The peasant who owed 30 days of labour service annually knew that he couldn't be required to work more without payment. The customary limits provided protection against unlimited exploitation, even for unfree peasants. The daily work hours on days when peasants did work were limited by daylight, by customary breaks, and by realistic human endurance. The medieval workday typically ran from sunrise to sunset with substantial break during midday, particularly in summer when working through hottest hours was impractical. The effective work might be 6 to 8 hours on work days rather than the 10 to 12 hours that early industrial workers endured. The pace of agricultural work, while physically demanding, allowed for breaks, for social interaction during work, and for self-pacing that factory discipline eliminated. The distinction between work and leisure that capitalism sharpened was less clear in medieval context, where many productive activities blended with social or recreational aspects. The spinning or sewing that peasant women did in the evening might be necessary work but was often done socially while talking with neighbours, The hunting or fishing that peasants engaged in provided food, but was also sport and recreation. The brewing of ale was essential household production, but also provided opportunity for socialising. The integration of work and social life meant that even productive activities had leisure dimensions. The harvest season exceptions that did require very long work days for several weeks were balanced by periods of minimal work. The harvest was genuinely demanding, dawn to dusk labour for weeks, to bring in crops while weather permitted. But it was temporary exception rather than year-round pattern. The peasant who worked 12-hour days during harvest might work 4-hour days, or not work at all during winter months. The seasonal balance meant that peak demands were compensated by slack periods. The household production work done primarily by women was substantial, but was also organised flexibly around other needs. The brewing, baking, textile production, food preservation, and various other household tasks were necessary and time-consuming, but didn't require rigid schedules. The peasant woman could organise her work around childcare, around social activities, around helping with field work during peak seasons. The flexibility of household work contrasted with rigid industrial discipline that came later. The comparison with early industrial labour shows how dramatically working conditions deteriorated with industrialisation before eventually improving. The factory workers in early industrial period worked 12 to 16 hours per day, 6 or 7 days per week, year-round, perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 hours annually, compared to medieval peasants' 1,200 to 1,600 hours. The early industrial working class lived shorter lives, had worse health, and worked far longer hours than medieval predecessors. The liberation from feudalism initially meant intensification of labour exploitation rather than improvement. The modern full-time employment requiring 40-hour weeks for roughly 50 weeks per year, accounting for vacation and holidays, totals approximately 2,000 hours annually, still substantially more than medieval peasant labour. The modern worker with typical American vacation allowance works perhaps 25 to 30% more hours per year than medieval peasant. Even contemporary workers in countries with generous vacation policies typically work more hours annually than medieval peasants. The comparison challenges narratives about modern workers being more leisured than medieval peasants. The commuting time that modern workers must add to their work hours didn't exist for peasants who lived where they worked. The hours spent travelling to and from work that many modern workers endure was unnecessary when fields were adjacent to cottages. The commuting time that can add 10 to 15 hours per week to modern work time had no medieval equivalent, making the gap between medieval and modern total time devoted to work-related activities even larger. The economic pressure requiring multiple jobs that affects many modern workers didn't typically apply to peasant agriculture, where household was productive, unit meeting most of its own needs. The modern worker needing 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet works far longer hours than officially recorded. The peasant household subsistence production met most needs without requiring additional wage labour, except occasionally the economic model that required less total labour to meet basic needs made peasant economy more time efficient than capitalism despite lower productivity. The technological improvements that supposedly reduced labour often instead intensified it. The labour-saving devices of capitalism saved employers' labour costs by eliminating workers rather than reducing hours for existing workers. The medieval peasant without labour-saving technology worked fewer hours than industrial worker with machines, because social organisation of labour mattered more than technology. The lesson that technology alone doesn't determine work hours challenges technological determinism about progress. Understanding work hours, reality reveals that medieval peasants had substantially more leisure time than modern workers, and far more than early industrial workers. The extensive religious holidays, the seasonal variations with slack periods, balancing peak demands, and the customary limits on labour services combined to create work year with perhaps 40 to 50% more leisure than modern full-time employment provides. The revelation that medieval peasants were more leisured than modern workers fundamentally challenges progressive narratives about history as continuous improvement in human conditions, and demonstrates that some aspects of life quality declined rather than improving with industrialisation, before eventually partially recovering in contemporary period. The diet of medieval peasants was substantially more varied, more nutritious, and more adequate than Victorian working-class diets, or than contemporary diets of many poor people surviving on processed foods. Understanding medieval peasant diet challenges stereotypes about constant near starvation, and reveals that nutritional standards declined rather than improving for several centuries after the medieval period. The caloric intake for medieval peasants in normal years was adequate to sustain physically demanding work and to maintain body weight. The studies of skeletal remains showing height and robustness comparable to or better than early modern populations suggest that caloric intake was generally sufficient. The pottage, bread, ale, and various other foods that form daily diet provided roughly 2,000 to 2,500 calories for women and 2,500 to 3,000 for men engaged in agricultural labour, adequate for nutritional needs. The adequacy of calories in normal years is an important qualifier, as bad harvests did cause periodic food shortages discussed later. The dietary variety that peasant meals included is surprising given stereotypes about monotonous gruel. The pottage that was dietary staple was actually complex dish combining grains, oats, barley or wheat depending on region, legumes, peas, beans, lentils, root vegetables, onions, leeks, turnips, carrots, leafy vegetables, cabbage, kale, and sometimes small amounts of meat or fish. The pottage varied daily based on what was available and what cook chose to add, providing variety within the basic format. The dietary diversity within pottage alone exceeded what many modern poor people eating processed foods achieve. The bread that was another dietary staple came in various forms and qualities. The wealthy ate white wheat bread, while peasants typically ate darker breads from rye, barley, or mixed grains. The peasant bread was actually more nutritious than refined white bread, containing more fibre, minerals and vitamins that milling removes. The medieval preference hierarchy that valued white bread over dark was actually inverse of nutritional value. The inferior dark bread that peasants ate was healthier than white bread that nobles preferred. The ale that every household brewed and that everyone, including children, drank daily, provided both calories and nutrition. The ale was weak by modern standards, perhaps 2 to 3% alcohol, and was safer to drink than water that might be contaminated. The brewing process involved grains and sometimes honey or herbs, providing nutritional value beyond just calories. The universal ale consumption meant that even when food was short, ale provided some nutrition. The modern perspective that sees constant alcohol consumption as problematic misses that weak ale was caloric and nutritional supplement rather than just intoxicant. The dairy products, including cheese, butter and occasionally milk, provided protein and fat in diets that were otherwise dominated by grains and vegetables. The peasant households that kept cows or had access to common pasture could produce dairy products for consumption and possibly for sale. The cheese particularly was a valuable protein source that kept well and that provided concentrated nutrition. The dairy consumption varied by region and by household wealth, but was a significant dietary component for many peasants. The meat consumption was less frequent than for wealthy classes, but was more common than stereotypes suggest. The peasants raised pigs that could forage in woods and that were slaughtered in autumn, providing preserved pork for winter. The chickens provided occasional meat and regular eggs. The hunting and poaching of rabbits, birds, and other game added meat despite being technically illegal. The fish from rivers and ponds provided protein, particularly on meatless days. The total meat consumption was perhaps once or twice per week rather than daily, but was a regular component of diet rather than rare luxury. The garden vegetables that peasant households grew in small plots near their cottages supplemented field crops with fresh vegetables through growing season. The onions, leeks, cabbage, kale, peas, beans, and various other vegetables provided vitamins and minerals along with fibre. The herbs for flavouring and for medicine were also garden products. The household gardens were managed primarily by women and provided important dietary supplements that enhanced both nutrition and flavour. The seasonal variation in diet that shifted from fresh vegetables in summer to stored grains and preserved foods in winter provided natural dietary diversity. The fresh produce of spring and summer gave way to stored foods during winter, but the preserved meats, stored grains, dried legumes and other winter foods were adequate to maintain nutrition even when fresh foods weren't available. The seasonal cycle created natural variety, even within subsistent agricultural system. The comparison with Victorian working-class diet reveals dramatic nutritional decline in the 19th century. The urban industrial workers lived on white bread, margarine, tea with sugar, and occasional scraps of meat diet that was calorie adequate but nutritionally deficient. The medieval peasant's diet of whole grains, legumes, vegetables, ale, and regular if not frequent meat and dairy was substantially more nutritious than Victorian workers' refined and processed foods. The nutritional decline from medieval to Victorian period was substantial and real. The comparison with modern poor diet, particularly in developed countries, shows similar patterns. The contemporary poor person surviving on fast food, processed snacks, sugary drinks, and cheap refined carbohydrates gets adequate calories but poor nutrition. The medieval peasant's varied diet of whole foods, despite being sometimes monotonous, provided better nutritional balance than modern diet dominated by processed foods high in sugar, salt, and unhealthy fats. The observation that medieval peasant diet was healthier than modern poverty diet is striking indictment of contemporary food system. The famine years that periodically affected medieval populations must be acknowledged as major qualification to generally adequate diet. The bad harvests caused by weather, by crop diseases, or by warfare did cause genuine food shortages that could progress to famine in severe cases. The famines of 1315 to 1317 and other crisis years saw genuine starvation and elevated mortality. Yet the frequency of severe famine was perhaps once per generation rather than constant condition, and normal years provided adequate nutrition. The periodic crises were real hardships, but don't negate the general dietary adequacy in most years. The food security that peasant agriculture provided in normal years was actually greater than landless wage labourers achieved in later periods. The peasant who grew most of his own food had direct control over his subsistence and wasn't dependent on wages or markets to buy food. The proletarian worker, who had to purchase all food from wages, was more vulnerable to market fluctuations, unemployment, and economic crisis. The subsistence security that peasant agriculture provided was genuine advantage that landless labour eliminated. The absence of nutritional diseases in skeletal evidence from medieval populations suggests generally adequate nutrition. The scurvy, rickets, and other specific nutritional deficiencies that appeared commonly in later periods were apparently uncommon in medieval peasant populations. The skeletal evidence suggests that dietary balance was sufficient to prevent deficiency diseases in most cases. The physical robustness evident in skeletons indicates that peasant diet supported healthy physical development. The integration of food production, preparation and consumption in household economy meant that peasants had control over their food in ways that wage labourers lost. The household that grew, processed and prepared its own food could ensure quality and could adapt to preferences in ways that dependence on purchased foods prevents. The autonomy over food system was quality of life factor that transcends pure nutrition. Understanding medieval peasant diet reveals that nutritional standards in normal years were adequate and often superior to diets of Victorian poor or contemporary poor relying on processed foods. The varied diet of whole grains, legumes, vegetables, dairy and regular meat provided balanced nutrition that supported healthy populations. The periodic famines were genuine hardships, but were exceptions rather than constant conditions. The dietary quality challenges stereotypes about constant hunger and reveals that nutritional progress has been uneven, with medieval peasants eating better in some ways than later industrial workers or contemporary poor, demonstrating that progress in food systems hasn't been linear improvement, but has included significant periods of dietary decline, particularly during early industrialization. The strong community bonds that characterized medieval village life provided social support, psychological satisfaction, and practical assistance that atomized modern society largely lacks understanding. The social dimension of peasant life reveals that social capital was genuine advantage that partially compensated for material poverty, while providing quality of life that wealth without community cannot match. The village community that was basic unit of peasant life created dense network of relationships spanning multiple generations and multiple families. The typical medieval village contained perhaps 50 to 200 people who knew each other intimately, who were often related by blood or marriage, and who interacted daily. The community wasn't merely residential proximity, but was a network of obligations, assistance, cooperation, and shared experiences that created genuine social integration. The level of social connection and mutual knowledge that village life created is almost unimaginable to modern urban dwellers who might not know their neighbours' names. The mutual assistance that community norms required meant that peasants could rely on neighbours for help during emergencies, during illness, during peak labour demands, and during various other times of need. The neighbour who fell ill could expect community members to help with their harvest. The family that lost their home to fire could expect neighbours to provide shelter and assistance in rebuilding. The social obligations that community membership created meant that no one faced crisis alone. The mutual aid was both moral obligation and practical necessity in society, without institutional safety nets. The communal work patterns where peasants cooperated for tasks that required multiple workers created both economic efficiency and social bonding. The harvest that required many hands, the building projects that needed cooperation, the common land management that required coordination, all these created contexts where people worked together, talked, joked, and built relationships while being productive. The integration of work and social interaction made labour less alienating than industrial work, where social interaction is limited and discouraged. The commons management requiring community coordination and cooperation created systems of self-governance that gave peasants genuine political participation. The decisions about when to open common fields to grazing, about allocation of common resources, about maintenance of shared infrastructure like mills or bridges, all required community decision-making. The village assemblies or manorial courts where peasants participated in governance provided political engagement that made peasants active citizens rather than merely passive subjects. The local autonomy over daily life issues provided genuine political agency. The generational continuity where families remained in same villages for generations created stability and sense of belonging that mobility destroys. The peasant lived where his grandparents had lived and where his grandchildren would live. The continuity created deep attachment to place and created sense of rootedness that modern mobility prevents. The knowledge of local landscape, of family history, of community traditions accumulated across generations created rich cultural knowledge that geographical mobility eliminates. The life cycle integration where communities marked major life transitions with collective celebrations and rituals created shared participation in individual lives. The baptisms, marriages, and funerals that brought community together marked individual transitions while reinforcing community bonds. The community participation in individual lives meant that personal milestones were collective events rather than purely private matters. The integration of individual and community lives created solidarity that modern individualism has largely destroyed. The festivals and celebrations that brought village together for religious and seasonal observances provided regular opportunities for community bonding, entertainment, and shared joy. The harvest festivals celebrating successful crops, the Christmas and Easter celebrations marking religious holidays, the Saints' Day observances honouring local patrons, all provided occasions when community gathered, feasted, drank, played games, and reinforced social bonds. The frequency of these gatherings, perhaps dozens per year, meant that community celebration was a regular feature of life rather than rare exception. The marriage patterns within and between nearby villages created extensive kinship networks, connecting community members. The peasant who married someone from same or nearby village was connecting families, creating new relationships, and extending kinship networks. The extensive kinship meant that villagers were likely related to each other in multiple ways, creating overlapping connections that strengthened community bonds. The kinship integration meant that community wasn't just neighbours but was extended family. The information sharing and gossip networks that characterised village life meant that everyone knew everyone's business, creating both support and social control. The lack of privacy that modern people would find oppressive had advantages. The neighbours' troubles were known and could be addressed. The social pressure enforced cooperative behaviour, and the shared information created common knowledge that facilitated coordination. The transparency that gossip created had costs, but also benefits in creating accountable community. The resolution of disputes within community through mediation and through customary law meant that conflicts were addressed through community processes rather than through distant impersonal authorities. The neighbours who had disputes brought them to manorial courts or to village assemblies where community members participated in justice. The local resolution of conflicts maintained community relationships while addressing grievances. The communal justice system provided closure and restored relationships rather than just punishing offenders. The social identity that derived from community membership provided sense of belonging and self-definition that transcended individual achievement. The peasant's identity was substantially defined by community membership. They were from particular village, from particular family, part of particular community. The social identity grounded in community provided secure sense of self that didn't depend on individual accomplishment. The belonging that community provided created psychological security that modern competitive individualism often fails to deliver. The emotional support that community provided during grief, during hardship, during crisis created safety net that wealth cannot replace. The community that mourned together when member died, that comforted the bereaved, that provided practical assistance during grief created support system that helped people survive tragedy. The shared emotional life of community meant that intense feelings were processed collectively rather than individually. The emotional solidarity provided resilience that individual coping often lacks. The comparison with modern social isolation, particularly in contemporary urban environments, reveals how much social capital has been lost. The modern person who doesn't know neighbours, who has few close friends, who lacks extended family nearby, who processes emotions alone, and who faces crisis without community support, experiences isolation that medieval peasant would find incomprehensible and horrifying. The social poverty of modern life is real deprivation that material wealth doesn't compensate for. The social media comparison that supposedly connects people actually provides shallow substitute for genuine community bonds. The online friends and followers don't provide practical assistance during crisis, don't share daily life, don't create obligations of mutual support, and don't provide the face-to-face interaction that creates genuine bonding. The modern substitutes for community largely fail to replicate what medieval villages provided. Understanding community dimensions reveals that medieval peasants lived in rich social environments that provided support, meaning, and connection that modern society often fails to deliver. The strong community bonds, the mutual assistance, the shared celebrations, the generational continuity, and the deep social integration created quality of life that transcended material conditions. The social capital that peasant communities possessed was genuine wealth that modern society has largely squandered in pursuit of individual freedom and geographic mobility. The recognition that medieval peasants were socially richer than many modern people, despite being materially poorer, challenges equations of wealth with well-being, and demonstrates that social connection is fundamental human need that modern society often fails to satisfy. The common lands that medieval peasants had access to provided economic resources that were essential for subsistence, while creating form of economic security that subsequent enclosure movements destroyed. Understanding the commons reveals dimension of medieval peasant life that was substantially better than what came after, and that provided advantages that modern capitalism fails to replicate. The common pasture lands where peasants could graze livestock provided access to protein and to transportation that private property ownership would deny. The peasant who had common rights could pasture cow, pigs, or geese on common lands without needing to own those lands. The commons access meant that even poor peasants could maintain livestock that provided dairy products, meat, and labour. The common pasture was an essential resource that made animal husbandry accessible to peasants who couldn't afford to own pasture privately. The common woods where peasants could gather firewood, could forage for nuts and berries, could collect building materials, and sometimes could pasture pigs provided multiple essential resources. The firewood was necessary for heating and cooking. The nuts, berries, and mushrooms supplemented diet. The wood for building and repairs was essential for maintaining housing. The swine could forage for acorns and other foods in forests. The multiple uses of common woodland made them extraordinarily valuable resources that enclosure eliminated. The common rights to collect deadfall wood, to cut turf for fuel, to quarry stone, and to access various other resources meant that peasants had legal access to resources that modern private property regimes deny. The commons weren't just unowned land, but were land with defined usage rights that custom and law protected. The legal protection of common rights meant that lords couldn't simply appropriate common resources, but had to respect customary access that peasants possessed. The legal framework protecting commons provided security that mere tolerance wouldn't have granted. The fishing rights in rivers, streams and ponds provided protein source that enriched diet, while providing recreational activity. The peasant who could fish in local waters had free access to protein that could supplement agricultural production. The fishing rights were valuable privileges that many peasants enjoyed, though lords tried to restrict fishing in some cases. The access to wild fish provided nutritional benefit while connecting peasants to natural environment. The gleaning rights that allowed peasants to collect leftover grain after harvest provided safety net for poor families. The custom that harvesters could collect fallen grain, that poor could gather from fields after harvest was complete, and that certain resources were available to anyone in need, all created informal social security that prevented destitution. The gleaning rights were legally protected customs that lords couldn't abolish without facing resistance and criticism. The value of commons access in total economic terms was substantial, perhaps providing 20 to 30% of household subsistence through combination of pasture, fuel, building materials, wild foods, and various other resources. The commons weren't marginal addition, but were essential component of peasant economy that made subsistence possible. The total economic value of commons access would be difficult to replace with cash income, meaning that loss of commons through enclosure effectively impoverished peasants, even if nominal wages increased. The enclosure movements that began in late medieval period and accelerated in early modern period systematically destroyed common rights, appropriating common lands to private ownership. The enclosures were justified as improving agricultural efficiency, but their primary effect was transferring resources from communal access to private ownership, enriching landowners while impoverishing peasants. The loss of commons meant that peasants had to purchase resources they had previously accessed freely, requiring more cash income just to maintain previous living standards. The enclosures represented major theft of resources from poor to rich, disguised as agricultural improvement. The comparison with modern property regimes reveals how thoroughly commons have been eliminated. The modern person who wants firewood must purchase it. The person who wants to pasture animals must own or rent land. The person who wants wild foods must forage on private land at risk of trespassing charges, or must purchase foraged foods at premium prices. The natural resources that were freely accessible to medieval peasants are now almost entirely privatized, requiring purchase through market rather than through customary access. The economic security that commons provided meant that peasant households had baseline subsistence that didn't depend entirely on monetary income. The household that could pasture livestock, gather fuel, and supplement diet through commons access needed less cash income than household that had to purchase all resources. The commons functioned as social security system, providing baseline resources that ensured survival. The loss of commons meant that survival became dependent on cash income from wages or markets, creating vulnerability to unemployment, price fluctuations, and economic crisis. The ecological sustainability that commons management often demonstrated challenged modern assumptions that private property is necessary for conservation. The tragedy of the commons theory suggesting that common property inevitably leads to overexploitation has been challenged by historians showing that medieval commons were often managed sustainably through community regulation. The stinting of pasture rights, the regulation of wood cutting, and the various customary rules governing commons use all created sustainable management that lasted centuries. The commons weren't inevitably degraded, but were often well-managed collective resources. The social equality that commons access, promoted by providing resources to rich and poor alike, created more egalitarian society than pure private property permits. The poor peasant who could pasture cow on commons had access to resource that private property would reserve for wealthy. The commons provided baseline equality that capitalism eliminates by making all resources purchasable commodities that only wealthy can afford. The commons promoted social cohesion by ensuring that everyone had access to essential resources. The attempt to recreate commons in modern context through public parks, public lands, and various other collective resources shows ongoing recognition that pure private property fails to meet all social needs. The public lands that allow recreation, gathering, and various uses are modern analogues to medieval commons, though much more restricted. the recognition that some resources should be collectively accessible rather than purely private shows that commons logic remains relevant. Understanding commons and their importance reveals that medieval peasants had economic security through access to common resources that subsequent enclosure movements destroyed. The commons provided pasture, fuel, building materials, wild foods, and various other resources that were essential for subsistence. The loss of commons through enclosure impoverished peasants by eliminating free access to resources that they had previously enjoyed. The economic security that commons provided was genuine advantage, that modern property regimes based purely on private ownership fail to replicate, demonstrating that medieval peasants had resource access that made them economically more secure in some ways than modern poor, who must purchase all resources through market, and who face destitution when monetary income fails. The skilled craft labour that characterised much peasant work provided genuine satisfaction, autonomy, and meaning that alienated industrial labour destroyed. Understanding the nature of peasant work reveals that job satisfaction and meaningful labour were dimensions of life quality where medieval peasants had advantages over modern, industrial and post-industrial workers. The agricultural skills required for successful farming were substantial and required deep knowledge accumulated over lifetime. The peasant needed to understand soil types and their requirements, needed to know when to plough and when to plant based on weather and season, needed to understand crop rotation and field management, needed to know how to maintain and repair tools, and possessed countless other skills that successful farming required. The agricultural work wasn't mindless repetitive labour, but was skilled craft requiring judgment, knowledge, and accumulated experience. The mastery of agricultural skills created pride and provided satisfaction that comes from competence. The craft specializations that many peasants developed in addition to farming, carpentry, blacksmithing, weaving, brewing, baking, pottery, and countless others, provided additional skills that created economic security and personal satisfaction. The peasant who was skilled carpenter could earn additional income through building projects. The woman skilled at brewing could sell ale. The craft skills were genuine human capital that provided economic value while creating satisfaction that comes from mastering complex skills. The craft knowledge was valuable and was respected by community. The autonomy over work process that peasants enjoyed was substantial compared to industrial labour. The peasant farmer decided when to work, decided how to organise work, decided what techniques to employ, and generally controlled their own labour process subject to seasonal requirements and customary obligations. The autonomy made work less alienating than factory labour, where workers had no control over process, pace, or techniques. The self-direction that peasant work allowed created satisfaction that subordinated labour prevents. The visible results of labour where peasants directly saw products of their work created satisfaction that abstract alienated labour denies the field of grain, the constructed building, the woven cloth, the brewed ale. All were tangible products directly resulting from workers' effort. The connection between labour and product was immediate and obvious, creating satisfaction that comes from visible accomplishment. The alienated labour, where workers produce components of products they never see, or where work consists of abstract services, prevents this satisfaction. The variety of tasks that peasant work involved prevented the monotony that characterises industrial labour. The agricultural year involved ploughing, planting, cultivating, harvesting, threshing, and numerous other distinct activities. The household economy involved diverse tasks from animal husbandry to textile production to food preservation. The diversity of work prevented the soul-crushing monotony of repeating identical tasks thousands of times per day. That assembly line work requires the variety created engagement and prevented boredom. The natural rhythms that structured agricultural work created patterns that respected human needs and natural cycles. The work that followed sun and seasons, that varied by weather and time of year, and that integrated with natural world created rhythm that industrial clock discipline destroyed. The natural pacing of agricultural work allowed for flexibility, for rest when weather prevented work, for adjustment to human needs in ways that rigid industrial discipline prevents. The integration with natural rhythms created healthier relationship with work than artificial industrial schedules impose. The social dimensions of work where much peasant labour was done cooperatively or at least in company of others, prevented the isolation that characterises much modern work. The harvest work done alongside neighbours, the household work done while talking with family, the craft work done in workshop with apprentices, all integrated work with social interaction. The conversation, joking, singing, and various social aspects of communal work made labour less alienating than isolated individual work. The social integration of work created community bonds while being productive. The life integration where work was part of integrated life, rather than being separated from home, family and community prevented the work-life balance problems that plague modern workers. The peasant worked where he lived, worked with family members, worked in patterns that integrated with the rest of life. The artificial separation of work and life that industrial capitalism created, the commuting between segregated zones, the rigid separation of work time and personal time, all these created fragmentation that peasant life avoided. The integration of work and life created wholeness that modern fragmentation destroys. The craft pride that skilled workers felt in their products created satisfaction that goes beyond monetary compensation. The carpenter who built house that would last generations, the weaver who created beautiful cloth, the brewer whose ale was praised by neighbours, all experience pride in craft that transcends wage labour. The quality of work product mattered both for practical reasons and for reputation, creating incentive for excellence that piece rate or hourly wages often undermine. The craft pride was real psychological reward that added to job satisfaction. The passing of skills through generations created continuity and created teaching relationships that transmitted human capital while building family bonds. The father, teaching son agricultural techniques, the mother teaching daughter textile skills, the master teaching apprentice craft knowledge. All these created intergenerational transmission of skills while building relationships. The teaching relationship added meaning to work by connecting it to continuity across generations. The family and community knowledge transmission made work culturally meaningful, beyond merely being economically necessary. The comparison with industrial labour reveals how thoroughly industrialisation destroyed work satisfaction. The factory worker repeating identical motion thousands of times per day, having no autonomy over work process, never seeing finished product, working in isolation or in dehumanising conditions, receiving wage that disconnects effort from product value. All these characteristics of industrial labour eliminated the satisfaction that craft work provided. The degradation of work was conscious strategy to reduce labour costs rather than unfortunate accident. The comparison with modern service and information work shows that even post-industrial economy often fails to restore work satisfaction that craft labour provided. The service worker following scripts, the office worker performing bureaucratic tasks disconnected from visible outcomes, the information worker manipulating abstractions, all often lack the visible results, autonomy, and craft pride that peasant work provided. The modern jobs often provide even less satisfaction than industrial labour, despite being less physically demanding. Understanding the nature of peasant work reveals that skilled craft labour, providing autonomy, variety, visible results, and pride in accomplishment, created job satisfaction that industrial and post-industrial labour often fails to match. The alienation of labour that capitalism created by separating workers from control over work process, from ownership of products, and from visible results, eliminated satisfactions that peasant work provided. The recognition that medieval peasants often had more satisfying work lives than modern employees challenges narratives about progress in working conditions and demonstrates that mechanisation and rationalisation of labour destroyed aspects of work quality, even while increasing productivity, suggesting that productivity and job satisfaction often conflict rather than aligning, as optimistic progress narratives assume. The local self-governance that characterised many aspects of medieval village life provided peasants with genuine political participation, real decision-making authority over matters affecting daily life, and meaningful citizenship that challenges stereotypes about peasants being passive victims of oppression without agency. Understanding political dimensions reveals that medieval peasants had more effective political voice in matters affecting them than many modern citizens have despite living in formal democracies. The village assemblies or village councils that existed in many regions provided forums where peasants collectively made decisions about community affairs. The assemblies decided about use of common lands, about allocation of resources, about contributions to collective needs, about enforcement of local customs, and about various other matters affecting village life. The assemblies were participatory bodies where peasant heads of household had voice and vote in decisions. The local democracy that village assemblies represented provided genuine political participation in matters that directly affected participants. The manorial courts, where peasants participated in justice and dispute resolution, created legal forums that peasants helped control. The manorial court included peasant jurors or assessors who participated in decisions alongside Lord Steward. The custom of the manor that governed many aspects of life was determined partly by community practice and memory that peasants controlled. The legal role that peasants played in manorial courts gave them voice in justice system and created accountability that pure top-down justice would lack. The custom and customary law that governed much of peasant life was substantially controlled by community memory and practice, rather than by written law imposed from above. But what custom dictated was determined by what community remembered and testified to be traditional practice. The peasants who testified about customary rights, who resisted changes to custom, and who collectively maintained customary practices controlled important dimensions of law that affected them. The customary law was living tradition that community substantially controlled, rather than being imposed entirely from external authority. The election of local officials, including reeves, haywards, and various other village officers, provided opportunities for peasants to hold positions of authority and responsibility. The officials who managed common lands, who supervised communal work, who enforced local bylaws, and who represented village to outside authorities were often elected by villagers from among themselves. The local offices provided leadership opportunities and created accountability that appointment from above wouldn't ensure. The rotation of offices through community meant that many peasants had experience exercising authority. The collective resistance to oppression, including protests, foot-dragging, sabotage, and sometimes rebellion, demonstrated that peasants had political agency, even against powerful opponents. The resistance could range from individual non-compliance to collective protest to armed rebellion. The peasant revolts that periodically erupted, the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525, and various other uprisings, demonstrated that peasants could organise politically and could pose genuine threat to established order when sufficiently provoked. The collective action capacity was real political power even when rebellions failed. The negotiation of obligations, where peasants sometimes successfully resisted increased demands or negotiated better terms, shows that relationship with lords wasn't entirely one-sided domination. The peasants who collectively refused increased rents or increased labour services, who appealed to custom to resist changes, or who threatened to flee to other lords could sometimes force concessions. The bargaining power that peasants possessed, while limited, was real and affected actual conditions. The relationship was exploitative, but wasn't pure domination without resistance or negotiation. The information control where peasants could conceal information from authorities or could present selective information that served their interests created power through knowledge. The lord who depended on peasant testimony about custom, who needed peasant cooperation to enforce policies, and who couldn't directly monitor all peasant activities faced informational limitations that peasants could exploit. The information asymmetry gave peasants some ability to shape what authorities knew and how policies were implemented. The mobility rights that many peasants enjoyed, particularly after the Black Death, provided exit option that constrained lords' behaviour. The peasant who could legally leave to find better conditions elsewhere had leverage in negotiating with current lord. The labour shortages that made peasant labour valuable gave peasants bargaining power that more abundant labour wouldn't provide. The mobility that allowed peasants to vote with their feet created market-like constraint on exploitation even in feudal system. The comparison with modern political participation reveals ironies where medieval peasants sometimes had more effective voice in matters affecting them than modern citizens have. The modern citizen can vote for distant representatives who make decisions about matters far removed from daily life, but often has little voice in decisions directly affecting their community, workplace, or immediate environment. The peasants' participation in village decisions about common resources, about local justice, and about community life was direct democracy over matters immediately affecting them. The trade-off between medieval local participation and modern representation suggests that democratization has been uneven. The workplace democracy that was implicit in household and craft production contrasts dramatically with modern workplaces where workers have no voice in decisions affecting their work. The peasant household, where family members collectively made decisions about work, organisation had more workplace democracy than modern employees who must follow orders from management. The craft workshop, where master, journeyman and apprentices worked together, had more collaborative elements than modern corporate hierarchies. The observation that peasants had more workplace democracy than modern workers is striking. The comparative effectiveness of political participation measured by ability to influence outcomes that affect one's life shows that peasants sometimes scored surprisingly well. The peasant whose village assembly decided about common resource use was directly influencing outcomes affecting him. The modern citizen whose vote is one of millions choosing representatives who make decisions about complex national and international issues has diluted influence. The local participation over local matters sometimes provided more effective political voice than national democracy over distant concerns. Understanding political dimensions reveals that medieval peasants had genuine political participation through village assemblies, manorial courts, customary law, local offices, and various forms of collective action. The local self-governance over matters directly affecting daily life provided meaningful citizenship that challenges stereotypes about peasants being powerless victims. The recognition that peasants had political agency and had meaningful voice in matters affecting them complicates narratives about political progress and suggests that democratization has been an uneven process, where gains in some dimensions accompanied losses in others, with modern citizens sometimes having less effective voice over matters directly affecting them than medieval peasants had despite formal democratic rights that medieval peasants lacked. The rich cultural life that medieval peasants enjoyed through numerous festivals, celebrations, games and communal entertainments provided leisure and cultural engagement that enriched life beyond mere subsistence. Understanding leisure and cultural dimensions reveals that peasants weren't merely surviving, but were actively engaging in cultural practices that created meaning, joy and community. The religious festivals that punctuated the year provided regular occasions for celebration, feasting and entertainment. The major festivals like Christmas, Easter and Whitsun involved services but also involved feasting, drinking, games and various entertainments. The village or community would gather, would share special foods and drinks, would play games, would sing and dance, and would generally celebrate together. The religious occasions were community celebrations as much as religious observances. The frequency of major festivals, perhaps a dozen or more per year, meant regular occasions for communal celebration. The Saints' Day celebrations honouring local patron saints or important saints provided additional occasions for festivities. The village that had patron saint would celebrate that Saints' Day with special fervour. The Saints' Day might involve processions, special services, feasting and entertainment. The local nature of many Saints' Day celebrations meant that different villages celebrated different days, creating localised festivals that strengthened community identity. The Saints' Days added dozens more celebration days to the calendar. The seasonal festivals marking agricultural cycle, planting festivals, midsummer celebrations, harvest festivals, provided celebrations tied to work rhythms. The harvest home celebration, when harvest was safely gathered, was a major festival involving feasting and Thanksgiving. The May Day celebrations welcoming spring involved games, dancing and courtship rituals. The seasonal festivals connected cultural life to natural and agricultural cycles, creating meaningful integration of work, nature and culture. The wedding celebrations that brought communities together for multi-day festivities involving feasting, drinking, dancing and games provided major social occasions. The wedding wasn't brief ceremony, but was extended celebration involving entire community. The feast, the dancing, the traditional games and customs, and the general revelry could continue for days. The communal participation in weddings reinforced social bonds while celebrating individual unions. The elaborate wedding celebrations provided entertainment and social occasion for entire community. The games and sports that peasants played included various ball games, wrestling, archery, football, and numerous other competitive and recreational activities. The games provided physical recreation, competitive outlet, and entertainment. The village games might pit different groups against each other, creating rivalry and excitement. The sports weren't formalised with written rules, but followed customary practices that participants understood. The regular game playing provided exercise, entertainment, and social bonding. The music and dance that characterised celebrations and that occurred informally provided important cultural expression. The peasants made music with simple instruments, sang traditional songs, and danced traditional dances. The music and dance were participatory rather than performance-based. Everyone joined rather than watching professionals. The active participation in music and dance created engagement rather than passive consumption. The musical traditions preserved cultural knowledge while providing enjoyment. The storytelling and oral traditions preserved cultural knowledge while entertaining audiences. The stories told around fires, the legends about local places, the tales about ancestors, the songs preserving historical events. All these maintained cultural memory while entertaining listeners. The oral culture was rich and sophisticated even without literacy. The storytelling was communal activity that created shared culture while passing time pleasantly. The mystery plays and religious dramas that communities performed provided theatrical entertainment while teaching religious narratives. The productions involved community members as actors, required collective effort to stage, and provided entertainment for entire community. The plays weren't professional theatre, but were community productions that engaged participants and audiences alike. The theatrical tradition provided cultural engagement while serving educational functions. The ales and communal gatherings that provided occasions for drinking, eating, and socialising were regular features of village life. The church ales raised funds for parish while providing social occasions. The various ales celebrating different occasions provided excuses for gathering and celebration. The communal drinking wasn't solitary alcoholism, but was social activity that strengthened community bonds. The ales were important social institutions that facilitated community interaction. The carnivals and periods of permitted excess like Carnival before Lent provided occasions for role reversal, satire, and release from normal constraints. The carnival celebrations involved costumes, mockery of authorities, sexual license, and general inversion of social norms. The permitted transgressions provided psychological release, while also reinforcing normal order through contained rebellion. The carnival traditions provided safety valve that made normal hierarchy more bearable. The comparison with modern leisure reveals interesting contrasts. The modern leisure that is heavily commercialised, that often involves passive consumption of professional entertainment, and that occurs in privatised spaces differs fundamentally from medieval communal participatory leisure. The watching television or movies, the consuming professional sports, the purchasing entertainment, all these are more passive and more isolated than medieval communal celebrations. The participatory nature of medieval leisure created different quality of experience than passive consumption provides. The work-leisure integration in medieval life, where leisure often grew naturally from work rhythms, contrasts with modern sharp separation between work time and leisure time. The harvest celebration that marked end of harvest work, the ale brewing that was both work and social occasion, the craft work that might be done while socialising, all these integrated work and leisure rather than rigidly separating them. The integration created more natural rhythms than modern separation of spheres imposes. Understanding leisure and cultural dimensions reveals that medieval peasants had rich cultural life, involving frequent festivals, communal celebrations, active participation in music and dance, games and sports, storytelling and oral traditions, and various forms of communal entertainment. The leisure activities were participatory rather than passive, were communal rather than isolated, and were frequent rather than rare. The cultural richness of peasant life challenges stereotypes about mere subsistence existence, and demonstrates that peasants actively created meaningful, cultural life that enriched existence beyond material conditions. The recognition that medieval leisure was in some ways superior to modern commercialised passive entertainment suggests that cultural progress has been uneven, and that some dimensions of cultural life may have declined rather than improving with modernity. The housing and material conditions that medieval peasants lived in were more adequate than stereotypes about primitive hovels suggest, with housing providing shelter that met basic needs while material possessions, though limited, included functional goods that sustained reasonable quality of life. Understanding material conditions reveals that while peasants were certainly not wealthy, they weren't living in desperate poverty, but had adequate material base supporting reasonable existence. The peasant cottages that housed rural families were simple structures, but were functional and adequate for their purposes. The typical cottage was 1 or 2 room structure with wooden frame, walls of wattle and daub or cob construction, and thatched roof. The construction materials were locally sourced and were appropriate for climate. The cottage kept out weather, provided shelter from wind and rain, maintained warmth from hearth fire, and housed family adequately if not luxuriously. The housing was simple but functional rather than being inadequate hovels. The hearth that was centre of cottage provided heat, light and cooking facility. The open hearth with fire burning created warm space during cold months. The same fire provided light during dark evenings and nights. The hearth was where food was cooked in pots hanging from hooks or set on stones. The multifunctional hearth was efficient use of fire that met multiple needs simultaneously. The smoke was a problem, cottages were smoky from fires without proper chimneys, but warmth and cooking capability made hearth essential despite smoke. The furnishings in peasant cottages were minimal but adequate. Benches or stools for sitting, table for eating, beds or mattresses for sleeping, chests for storage. The furniture was simple and handmade but served its functions. The household that had basic furniture for sitting, eating, sleeping and storage had what was necessary for daily life. The lack of elaborate furniture reflected both limited resources and limited need. The cottage wasn't where people spent all their time, so elaborate furnishing wasn't necessary. The household goods, including pottery for cooking and eating, tools for various tasks, textile implements for spinning and sewing, brewing equipment and various other functional items provided equipment for household production. The household that had cooking pots, eating vessels, work tools and necessary equipment could function adequately. The possessions weren't luxurious, but were sufficient for needs. The functionality rather than luxury was what mattered for peasant material culture. The clothing that peasants wore was simple but adequate. Tunics, hose, cloaks made from wool or linen. The clothing was handmade, often using materials produced in household from sheep raised or flax grown by family. The clothing wasn't fashionable, but kept people warm and covered. The multiple garments that people owned allowed changing while one set was washed. The clothing adequacy meant that peasants weren't freezing or naked but had appropriate dress for climate and activities. The bedding including mattresses stuffed with straw or chaff, blankets woven from wool, and pillows provided sleeping comfort that wasn't luxurious but was adequate. The bed wasn't merely floor but was raised sleeping surface with cushioning. The blankets provided warmth during cold nights. The bedding met basic needs for comfortable sleep, even if it wasn't the comfort modern people expect. The sleeping arrangements were adequate for rest, even if simple. The sanitation that was admittedly limited by modern standards wasn't as dire as sometimes portrayed. The privies or outdoor latrines provided facilities more sanitary than simply defecating anywhere. The washing of hands and faces in basins, the occasional bathing, and the various hygiene practices that did exist meant that peasants weren't as filthy as stereotypes suggest. The sanitation was certainly inferior to modern plumbing, but wasn't complete absence of hygiene. The standards were lower but weren't non-existent. The comparison with later periods, particularly with urban industrial slums of the 19th century, reveals that peasant housing was often superior to Victorian working-class housing. The industrial slums, with multiple families crowded in single rooms, with no sanitation, with no access to outdoors or to clean water, and with appalling conditions that spread disease, were arguably worse than medieval peasant cottages. The peasant cottage with garden, with nearby fields and woods, with clean air, and with space was healthier environment than urban slum. The comparison challenges narratives of continuous improvement in housing conditions. The regional and temporal variations in housing quality complicate generalizations about peasant housing. The housing in different regions varied substantially based on climate, available materials and local customs. The housing quality also improved over time, particularly after Black Death, when labour shortages improved peasant bargaining power. The variations mean that describing typical peasant housing risks oversimplification. The range from poor to adequate cottages was substantial. The improvement over time, particularly in late medieval period when peasant conditions generally improved, meant that 15th century peasants lived better than 13th century peasants. The housing improvements, the acquisition of more possessions, and the general rise in material standards meant that late medieval peasants often had significantly better material conditions than earlier centuries. The temporal trend was toward improvement during later medieval period, though this reversed in some regions during early modern period. Understanding housing and material conditions reveals that while peasant housing and possessions were certainly simple, and while they would be considered inadequate poverty by modern standards, they provided adequate shelter and functional goods that met basic needs. The cottage kept out weather, the hearth provided warmth and cooking, the furnishings served their purposes, and the possessions were sufficient for household production and daily life. The material conditions weren't luxurious, but supported reasonable existence. The comparison with later periods showing that some material conditions actually worsened rather than steadily improving challenges, narratives of continuous progress. The recognition that medieval peasant material conditions met basic needs and were sometimes superior to later working class conditions demonstrates that material progress has been uneven and that medieval peasants weren't living in the desperate poverty that stereotypes suggest. The health and longevity of medieval peasants was limited by lack of modern medicine and by periodic epidemics, but in normal times was reasonably good, with skeletal evidence suggesting that peasants who survived childhood often lived into their 50s or 60s in good health. Understanding health dimensions reveals that while medieval mortality was certainly higher than modern rates, the gap isn't as dramatic as sometimes assumed, and medieval health had some advantages over later periods. The life expectancy at birth that was low in medieval period, perhaps 30 to 35 years, was substantially depressed by high infant and childhood mortality. The figures that half or more of children died before adulthood drastically reduced average life expectancy, yet the life expectancy at age 20 for those who survived childhood was perhaps 45 to 55 years depending on period and region, meaning that adults commonly lived into middle age and often into old age. The focus on life expectancy at birth obscures that adults often lived reasonably long lives. The skeletal evidence from medieval cemeteries shows physical robustness suggesting adequate nutrition and physical health. The skeletal remains show people who were well developed physically, who had strong bones, who showed limited evidence of nutritional deficiency diseases, and who often reached heights comparable to modern populations. The physical development evident in skeletons suggests that those who survived childhood generally had adequate nutrition and reasonable health. The skeletal robustness challenges images of stunted, chronically ill populations. The dental health visible in skulls shows patterns different from modern dental problems. The medieval teeth showed wear from coarse diet, but showed relatively little decay compared to later periods when sugar became common. The dental pattern suggests diet that was abrasive but not cavity-causing. The medieval dental health was often better than 18th or 19th century dental health. Among poor who consumed sugar, the teeth evidence supports claims about diet being adequate and relatively healthy. The diseases that affected medieval populations included periodic epidemics like plague that caused catastrophic mortality, but also included endemic diseases that people lived with. The plague outbreaks were genuinely devastating, killing perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of population during Black Death. Yet between plague years, health was apparently reasonably good. The endemic diseases that affected populations existed, but didn't prevent generally functional health for most people most of the time. The epidemic diseases were crises rather than constant conditions. The comparison with early modern and early industrial health shows that some health indicators actually worsened in the 16th to 18th centuries before eventually improving. The urban populations particularly showed declining health indicators, decreasing heights suggesting worsening nutrition, increasing mortality rates, spreading of new diseases. The Industrial Revolution initially further worsened working-class health before eventually improving. The pattern suggests that medieval health was often better than early modern or early industrial health, challenging narratives of continuous improvement. The physical labour that peasant life required kept people physically fit and strong. The agricultural work, while sometimes grueling, provided exercise that maintained cardiovascular health, muscle strength, and general fitness. The active lifestyle meant that peasants didn't face the sedentary lifestyle diseases that plague modern populations. The physical fitness from active work life was a health advantage that offset lack of medical care to some degree. The outdoor life that peasant work required meant extensive sun exposure that synthesized vitamin D, preventing deficiency diseases. The outdoor work meant that peasants didn't suffer vitamin D deficiency that caused rickets and other problems among urban populations living indoors. The sun exposure was health benefit that urban living eliminated. The outdoor life also meant breathing fresh air rather than polluted urban air that caused respiratory problems. The whole foods diet that peasants ate, already discussed in nutrition section, supported health better than processed foods that came later. The diet of whole grains, legumes, vegetables and limited meat and dairy provided balanced nutrition without processed sugars, refined flour or artificial additives. The natural foods diet supported health even when calories were sometimes inadequate. The food quality partially compensated for occasional food shortages. The community support in illness that village communities provided meant that sick people weren't isolated, but received care from family and neighbours. The mutual assistance during illness provided both practical care and emotional support. The community nursing of sick wasn't professional medical care, but was genuine care that helped people recover when possible. The social support during illness was health resource that atomized modern society often fails to provide. The herbal medicine and folk healing that existed provided some genuine medical treatments alongside useless or harmful practices. Some medieval remedies, willow bark for pain, containing aspirin-like compound, honey for wounds, genuine antimicrobial, various herbs with real medicinal properties, actually worked. Other treatments were useless or harmful. The folk medicine was mixed in effectiveness but wasn't entirely without value. The herbal knowledge represented accumulated empirical learning that had some basis. The absence of industrial pollutants and toxins meant that medieval peasants weren't exposed to various environmental hazards that industrialization created: the lead exposure, the mercury, the various toxic chemicals. The air and water pollution that came with industrialization didn't exist in medieval countryside. The clean environment was health advantage that industrial development destroyed. The pre-industrial environment was healthier in many ways than industrial environment. The limitations of medieval healthcare, including lack of antibiotics, lack of surgical capabilities, lack of understanding of disease causation, and various other medical ignorance certainly meant that many deaths occurred, that modern medicine prevents the infections that would be easily cured with antibiotics killed medieval people. The conditions that would be surgically corrected caused disability or death. The infectious disease that hygiene and vaccination prevent spread freely. The medical limitations were real and caused preventable deaths by modern standards. Understanding health dimensions reveals that while medieval peasants certainly faced health challenges and died from causes that modern medicine prevents, their health wasn't as universally poor as stereotypes suggest. The adults who survived childhood often lived into their 50s or 60s in reasonably good health. The physical robustness, dental health, physical fitness from active work, nutritious diet, clean environment and community support all contributed to health that was reasonably good by pre-modern standards, and that was sometimes better than early modern or early industrial health. The recognition that health didn't improve linearly, but worsened in some periods before eventually improving challenges progressive narratives, and demonstrates that medieval peasant health was adequate baseline from which later changes were sometimes regressions rather than improvements. As this comprehensive exploration of medieval peasant life concludes, what emerges most powerfully is recognition that the reality was far more complex, nuanced, and in specific dimensions genuinely superior to both later historical periods and to aspects of modern life than simplistic stereotypes about medieval misery suggest. The surprising truth that medieval peasants had genuine advantages in work hours, in community bonds, in access to common resources, in work satisfaction, in political participation, in cultural richness, and in various other dimensions challenges progressive narratives about history as continuous improvement, while revealing that progress has been uneven process where gains in some areas accompanied losses in others that deserve recognition and perhaps mourning. The work hours reality showing that peasants worked perhaps 150 to 200 days per year, compared to modern full-time employment requiring 250 days, demonstrates that medieval peasants were substantially more leisured than contemporary workers. The extensive religious holidays, seasonal variations with slack periods, and customary limits on labour services combined to create work year with dramatically more leisure than modern capitalism provides. The revelation that medieval peasants had more free time than modern workers fundamentally challenges assumptions about industrial capitalism, liberating workers from medieval oppression, when reality was that early industrialization dramatically intensified work, before labour movements eventually won back some of the leisure that peasants had possessed. The diet quality showing that medieval peasants in normal years ate varied nutritious meals of whole grains, legumes, vegetables, dairy and regular meat challenges stereotypes about constant hunger, while revealing that nutritional standards in some ways declined during industrialization, before eventually improving. The comparison showing that peasant diet was healthier than Victorian working class diet, or than contemporary poverty diet of processed foods, demonstrates that nutritional progress has been uneven, and that medieval peasants often ate better than poor people in later eras, despite having lower food production capacity. The community bonds showing that medieval villages provided dense social networks, mutual assistance, shared celebrations, and genuine solidarity reveals that social capital was dimension of wealth, where peasants were rich despite material poverty. The strong communities provided psychological support, practical assistance, and belonging that atomized modern society largely fails to replicate. The recognition that medieval peasants were socially richer than many isolated modern individuals despite being materially poorer challenges equations of well-being with individual wealth, and demonstrates that social connection is fundamental human need that modern society often fails to satisfy. The access to common resources showing that peasants had legal rights to pasture, fuel, building materials and various other resources provided economic security that subsequent enclosure movements destroyed. The commons functioned as social safety net ensuring baseline subsistence independent of cash income. The loss of commons through enclosure impoverished peasants by eliminating resource access that they had previously enjoyed, demonstrating that this represented genuine theft of collective resources disguised as agricultural improvement. The commons provided economic security that modern pure private property regimes fail to replicate. The skills and work satisfaction showing that peasant labour involved genuine craft, requiring accumulated knowledge, provided autonomy over work process, created visible results, and generated pride in accomplishment reveals that alienation of labour was creation of industrial capitalism rather than being natural condition of work. The job satisfaction that craft labour provided was dimension of life quality that industrial rationalisation deliberately destroyed in pursuit of productivity. The recognition that medieval peasants often had more satisfying work than modern employees challenges assumptions about progress in working conditions. The local governance showing that village assemblies, manorial courts, customary law, and various forms of collective action provided peasants with genuine political participation in matters directly affecting their lives reveals that political voice was dimension, where peasants sometimes compared favourably to modern citizens. The local democracy over local matters provided effective political participation that modern representation over distant concerns often fails to match. The recognition that peasants had meaningful political agency challenges, narratives about political progress being simply expansion of rights, without consideration of effectiveness of participation. The festivals and cultural life showing that numerous celebrations, communal entertainments, participatory music and dance, and various cultural practices created rich leisure and cultural engagement, demonstrates that peasants actively created meaningful cultural life-enriching existence beyond material subsistence. The participatory nature of medieval leisure contrasts with passive consumption that characterises much modern entertainment. The cultural richness challenges images of peasants merely surviving rather than actually living full cultural lives. The housing and material conditions showing that while certainly simple, peasant cottages and possessions were adequate for basic needs, and were sometimes superior to Victorian working-class housing reveals that material conditions didn't improve linearly, but actually worsened in some periods. The comparison with urban industrial slums demonstrates that housing progress has been uneven, and that medieval peasant housing was functional and adequate even if simple. The health outcomes showing that adults who survived childhood often lived into their 50s or 60s in reasonably good health, that skeletal evidence suggests physical robustness and adequate nutrition, and that some health indicators actually worsened in early modern period reveals that health didn't improve continuously, but declined in some eras before eventually advancing. The medieval health baseline was adequate and was sometimes superior to what came immediately after. The regional and temporal variations that complicate simple generalizations about peasant life remind us that medieval Europe spanned centuries and diverse regions where conditions varied substantially. The peasant life in prosperous 15th century England differed from peasant life in poor 14th century region of France. The variations mean that generalizations require careful qualification, yet the patterns discussed were widespread enough to challenge stereotypes about universal medieval misery. The comparative framework showing that peasant conditions often compared favourably to urban industrial working class of the 18th and 19th centuries, before eventually improving, demonstrates that progress hasn't been linear but has included significant regressions. The Industrial Revolution initially worsened working and living conditions for poor before labour movements and reform eventually improved them. The pattern shows that medieval baseline was adequate, and that subsequent changes weren't uniformly progressive. The overall assessment recognising that medieval peasant life included genuine hardships, periodic famines, epidemic diseases, political oppression, limited medical care, high childhood mortality, alongside the advantages discussed, creates balanced picture rejecting both romanticisation and demonisation. The peasant life wasn't utopian, and returning to medieval conditions would be neither possible nor desirable. Yet the recognition that peasants had genuine advantages in specific dimensions of life quality that modern society has failed to preserve or replicate suggests that progress has been uneven, and that some things worth valuing were lost in transition to modernity. The lessons for contemporary society include recognition that progress is multidimensional rather than linear, that gains in some areas can accompany losses in others, that material wealth doesn't necessarily correlate with life satisfaction, that social connections matter more than often acknowledged, that leisure time is component of life quality worth preserving, that meaningful work and autonomy are important for satisfaction, that common resources and social safety nets provide security that pure private property fails to ensure, and that learning from past doesn't require romanticising it, but does require honestly assessing what was lost alongside what was gained. As light returns and this exploration of medieval peasant life concludes, what remains is recognition that the past was more complex than stereotypes admit, that medieval peasants lived lives that in specific dimensions were genuinely better than later periods, and even better than aspects of modern life, and that honest assessment requires acknowledging both hardships and advantages, rather than reducing medieval life to simple narrative of misery from which modernity rescued humanity. The medieval peasants who worked fewer days per year than modern employees, who ate nutritious varied diets in normal years, who lived in strong supportive communities, who had access to common resources ensuring economic security, who performed skilled meaningful work providing genuine satisfaction, who participated in local governance over matters affecting them, who celebrated numerous festivals enriching cultural life, who lived in adequate if simple housing, and who enjoyed reasonably good health when they survived childhood, were living lives that deserve recognition as complex human existence, with genuine quality of life advantages, alongside acknowledged hardships. The surprising truth that medieval peasants lived better than stereotypes suggests challenges, assumptions about progress, while revealing that history is more complex than simple narratives of advancement from darkness to light acknowledge. The recognition that peasants had advantages worth understanding, and perhaps emulating in some dimensions, doesn't require romanticising medieval period, but rather requires honest assessment that some aspects of pre-industrial life supported human flourishing in ways that industrialisation damaged or destroyed. The lesson that progress is uneven, and that advancement requires preserving what was valuable from past while addressing its limitations, remains relevant for contemporary society, navigating challenges of post-industrial economy and seeking to create societies supporting human flourishing in all its dimensions, including the social connection, meaningful work, adequate leisure, political participation, and community support that medieval peasants possessed, and that modern society too often fails to provide.